When I received an inheritance from my grandfather, my relatives accused me of injustice and threatened to sue me. I just smiled without saying a word, but the documents I pulled out later changed everything. My name's Michael. I'm 32, born and raised in the Chicago suburbs. You know how it is. You grow up thinking your family's pretty normal until something happens that shows you just how messed up everyone really is. That something happened 3 months ago when Grandpa died. The old man lived to be 89, sharp as a tack until the very end. He was one of those old-school guys who never threw anything away and kept everything organized in labeled boxes. His house smelled like Old Spice and coffee, and he had this weird habit of collecting vintage pocket watches that he'd wind up every Sunday morning like clockwork. So there we were, packed into his living room like sardines for the reading of the will. The whole family showed up, and I mean everyone. My mom, my brother Jake, Aunt Linda with her husband Bob, cousin Sarah, even great-aunt Martha, who nobody had seen since 1998. The lawyer, this stern-looking woman in her 50s, sat at Grandpa's old oak dining table with a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. The tension in that room was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Everyone was trying to act all sad and respectful, but I could see the dollar signs practically flashing in their eyes. Grandpa had been pretty well off, owned a successful plumbing business for 40 years, never spent money on anything fancy, just lived simple and saved everything. The lawyer started reading through all the standard stuff. The house went to Mom, which nobody argued with since she'd been taking care of him the last few years. Some money got divided between the grandkids for college funds. His tools went to Jake, who actually knew how to use them. Aunt Linda got his china collection, which was worth a decent chunk of change. But then came the part that changed everything. The lawyer cleared her throat and read the final item on the list. Apparently, Grandpa had this one special pocket watch, a gold one he'd inherited from his father back in the day. The thing looked ancient and probably weighed about as much as a small brick. I'd seen it a few times when I was a kid, but honestly never paid much attention to it. Well, turns out that watch was going to me. Just me, not split up, not sold and divided. Straight up mine according to the will. The exact words were something like, "My gold pocket watch shall go to my grandson Michael as a personal gift of appreciation." You should have seen the faces around that room. Aunt Linda's mouth dropped open like she was trying to catch flies. Jake looked like someone had just told him his lottery ticket was a fake. Even Mom raised her eyebrows, though she tried to play it cool. Now, I should probably mention that I wasn't exactly the golden child of the family. Don't get me wrong. I loved Grandpa and visited him regularly, but Jake was always the one who helped with house repairs and yard work. Linda was the one who organized all the family gatherings and made sure he got his doctor appointments. I was just a guy who showed up for Sunday dinners and listened to his old war stories. So yeah, everyone was pretty shocked that I was getting anything special, let alone something that looked like it might actually be worth some serious cash. The watch was definitely old-school elegant, gold case, intricate engravings, the kind of thing that screamed family heirloom. The lawyer wrapped up the reading, packed up her papers, and basically got out of there faster than a cat with its tail on fire. Smart woman. She could probably feel the storm brewing. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, all hell broke loose. Linda was the first to explode. She started going off about how unfair it was, how she'd done so much more for Grandpa than I ever had, how there must be some mistake in the paperwork. Jake chimed in, suggesting maybe Grandpa wasn't thinking clearly when he made the will, or maybe someone had influenced him somehow. I just sat there holding this heavy old watch, trying to figure out why a simple timepiece was causing World War III in my family. The thing felt solid and well-made, sure, but it's not like I thought it was a Hope diamond or anything. Maybe it was worth a few $100 as an antique, maybe $1,000 if we were lucky. Mom tried to play peacekeeper, suggesting we all just calm down and respect Grandpa's wishes. But Linda and Jake were having none of it. They started talking about getting their own lawyer, about contesting the will, about how this whole thing wasn't fair to the rest of the family. The argument went on for about an hour before everyone finally stormed out. I ended up sitting alone in Grandpa's living room, still holding that watch and wondering what the heck just happened. The house felt empty and sad without all the shouting, just a tick-tick-tick of his grandfather clock in the corner marking time like nothing had changed. I looked down at the watch in my hands, really studying it for the first time. The gold was tarnished but still beautiful, and there were these intricate patterns carved all around the edges. When I opened it up, there was some kind of inscription inside that I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. That night, I took the watch home and put it on my nightstand. Every few minutes I'd pick it up and look at it, trying to understand why Grandpa had chosen me specifically to receive it. What was so special about this particular watch that he'd wanted to make sure it stayed in the family? And more importantly, why was everyone else so bent out of shape about it? I figured I'd take it to a jeweler or maybe an antique dealer the next week, just to get appraised and find out what we were really dealing with. Maybe if I could put a dollar figure on it, the family drama would settle down and we could all move on with our lives. Boy, was I wrong about that. What I discovered about that watch ended up turning our whole family upside down and taught me more about my grandfather than I'd learned in 32 years of knowing him. Sometimes the people you think you know best are the ones hiding the biggest secrets, and sometimes a simple family inheritance can crack open a whole can of worms you never saw coming. So the next Monday, I decided to get some answers about this watch that was tearing my family apart. I wasn't looking to sell it or anything. I just wanted to know what we were dealing with. You know how it is when something becomes the center of drama. You start wondering if maybe you're missing something obvious. I drove over to Murphy's Pawn and Jewelry, this little hole-in-the-wall place I'd passed 1,000,000 times but never actually been inside. The owner, this old Irish guy named Pat Murphy, had been in business there for like 30 years. His shop was crammed floor to ceiling with everything you could imagine: guitars, power tools, jewelry, old coins, even a stuffed moose head that stared at you when you walked in. Pat was behind the counter when I walked in, reading a newspaper through these thick glasses that made his eyes look huge. He looked up when the bell jingled and gave me that friendly but cautious smile that pawn shop owners perfect over the years. You know the look. Interested but not too eager, helpful but ready for anything. I pulled out the watch and set it on the counter. Pat glanced at it casually at first, then did this double take. That made me pay attention. He set down his newspaper and picked up the watch with both hands, handling it like it was made of eggshells. The guy spent about 5 minutes just looking at the outside of the watch, turning it over and over in his hands. He had this jeweler's loop that he screwed into his eye, and he was examining every inch of the thing like he was studying for a final exam. The whole time he's making these little humming noises under his breath. You know, those sounds people make when they're thinking hard about something. Then he opened the watch, and I swear his face went completely white. He looked up at me, then back at the watch, then back at me again. He set the watch down very carefully on a little velvet pad and took off his glasses to clean them, which seemed like a stalling tactic, if I ever saw one. Finally, he looked at me and asked where I got it. I explained about my grandfather passing away and leaving it to me in the will. Pat nodded slowly, like he was processing this information and trying to decide something important. Then he asked if I knew anything about the watch's history, and I told him honestly that I didn't have a clue. Pat walked over to his computer, this ancient Dell that probably took 5 minutes to boot up, and started typing something. While he was searching, he kept glancing back at the watch like it might disappear if he looked away too long. The suspense was killing me, but I didn't want to seem too eager or desperate. After what felt like forever, Pat printed out something from his computer and brought it over to the counter. It was a black and white photograph, kind of grainy like those old newspaper pictures. He set it down next to my grandfather's watch and pointed to the photo. In the picture was a man in a fancy suit and hat, and hanging from his vest was a pocket watch that looked exactly, and I mean exactly, like the one sitting on Pat's counter. The man in the photo had this confident, almost cocky expression, and even though the picture was old and fuzzy, there was something intimidating about him. Pat tapped the photo and said the words that changed everything. This was Al Capone's personal pocket watch. Not a replica, not something similar. The actual watch that belonged to the most famous gangster in Chicago history. He showed me the inscription inside that I'd barely been able to make out. It had Capone's initials and a date from 1925. I felt like someone had just told me I'd been carrying around the Hope diamond in my back pocket. Al Capone, Scarface himself, had owned this watch. The same watch my sweet old grandfather had left me in his will. My mind was racing with about 1,000 questions, but the biggest one was obvious. How the hell did Grandpa end up with Al Capone's watch? Pat explained that he'd seen this watch before in historical documents and auction catalogs. Apparently, it had disappeared from Capone's possessions sometime in the 1940s and had been considered lost ever since. Collectors have been looking for it for decades. The thing wasn't just valuable because it was old and gold. It was a legitimate piece of American crime history. He estimated its worth somewhere in the ballpark of $350,000. Maybe more if it went to auction, and collectors got into a bidding war. I had to sit down when he said that number. $350,000. For a watch. A watch that my grandfather had somehow acquired and never mentioned to anyone in the family. I walked out of that pawn shop feeling like I was in some kind of weird dream. Half the time I was excited about potentially having enough money to pay off my student loans, buy a house, maybe take that trip to Europe I'd been talking about for years. The other half of the time, I was completely freaked out about how this watch had ended up in my family in the first place. Did Grandpa know what he had? He must have, right? You don't just accidentally end up with Al Capone's personal effects. But if he knew, why didn't he ever tell anyone? Why didn't he sell it himself if he needed money? And why leave it specifically to me instead of splitting the value among the whole family? The drive home was a blur. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, where the watch sat in its little box, wondering if I was being paranoid or if other drivers were somehow staring at my car. $350,000. That was more money than I'd ever seen in my life, sitting right there next to my Starbucks cup and a pile of old receipts. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to tell anyone in the family about the watch's true value or history. Not yet, anyway. I needed to do some research first, figure out how Grandpa had gotten his hands on it, and maybe most importantly, understand what it meant that he'd chosen to leave it to me. That night, I spent hours on Google reading everything I could find about Al Capone and his personal belongings. Turns out the guy was pretty fond of expensive jewelry and accessories, gold watches, diamond rings, fancy cufflinks. The works. He liked to show off his wealth, probably as a way of intimidating people and show his status in the criminal world. The watch had been mentioned in several FBI reports from the 1930s and 40s. Agents had cataloged it as part of Capone's personal effects, but had vanished sometime after his death in 1947. There were theories that family members had sold off his belongings quietly or that some items had been stolen, but nobody knew for sure what had happened to most of his personal collection. I closed my laptop around midnight, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about my grandfather, this quiet, hard-working plumber who fixed sinks and unclogged toilets for a living, somehow crossing paths with the most notorious criminal in Chicago history. It didn't add up, but the evidence was sitting right there on my nightstand. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I had vacation days saved up, and I figured finding out the truth about this watch was more important than sitting in meetings all day. I drove over to Grandpa's house, which Mom hadn't started cleaning out yet, and spent the day going through his papers and belongings more carefully than we had during the will reading. What I found in his basement changed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather and explained why the rest of my family was about to lose their minds when they found out what I discovered. Sometimes the people closest to you are hiding secrets that would blow your mind, and sometimes a simple inheritance opens doors you never knew existed. I should have known that keeping the watch's true value secret would be impossible in my family. We're not exactly known for our discretion, and apparently, I inherited Grandpa's terrible poker face along with his watch. It took exactly 4 days for everything to blow up. It started when Jake stopped by my apartment unannounced, which should have been my first red flag. My brother never just drops by. He's the type who schedules his spontaneous moments. He brought coffee and donuts, acting all casual and friendly. But I could tell something was up. He kept glancing around my living room like he was casing the joint. After about 10 minutes of small talk about work and the weather, Jake finally cut to the chase. He asked if I'd gotten the watch appraised yet, and like an idiot, I told him about going to the pawn shop. I didn't mention the whole Al Capone thing, but I made the mistake of saying it might be worth more than we originally thought. Jake's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. He started asking all these questions. How much more? What made it special? Whether I was planning to sell it. I tried to play it cool, but you know how it is with siblings. He could read me like a book, and he knew I was holding back something big. The next day, Aunt Linda called. Not texted, not emailed. Actually called my landline, which nobody ever does anymore. She had that fake sweet voice she uses when she wants something, asking how I was doing and whether I learned anything interesting about Grandpa's watch. Apparently, Jake had called her right after leaving my place. I should have just hung up, but instead I made another stupid mistake. I told her I was still researching the watch's history and that it might have some collector value. Linda got quiet for a minute, then asked if I thought it was fair to keep something that valuable all to myself when the rest of the family had done so much for Grandpa over the years. That's when I realized this whole thing was about to get ugly. See, Linda had always been the self-appointed family matriarch since Grandma died. She organized all the holidays, kept track of everyone's birthdays, and generally acted like she was in charge of maintaining family harmony. But underneath all that sweetness, she was ruthless when it came to money. I tried to explain that the will was clear and legally binding, but Linda wasn't having it. She started going on about moral obligations and family fairness, how Grandpa probably didn't understand the watch's true value when he made the will, how it wasn't right for one person to benefit so much more than everyone else. By the weekend, the whole extended family knew something was up. Cousin Sarah called to ask if I was really planning to sell a family heirloom. Great Aunt Martha, who hadn't spoken to anyone in years, somehow got my number and left a rambling voicemail about respecting Grandpa's memory. Even my mom started asking pointed questions about why everyone was so worked up over an old watch. The final straw came on Sunday when Jake and Linda showed up at my door together. They had this whole intervention planned out, complete with printed copies of articles about estate law and family mediation services. Linda was carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet, and Jake looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but was going along with his aunt's plan. They wanted me to agree to sell the watch and split the proceeds equally among all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Linda had it all figured out. If the watch was worth even $20,000 or $30,000, everyone could get a nice little windfall. She made it sound so reasonable and fair, like I was being selfish for wanting to keep what Grandpa had specifically left to me. I told them I needed more time to research the watch's history before making any decisions. That's when Linda dropped her bombshell. She'd already consulted with a lawyer about contesting the will. According to her research, if they could prove that Grandpa didn't understand the watch's true value when he wrote the will, they might be able to get it declared invalid. Jake looked uncomfortable when Linda started talking about legal action, but he didn't back down. He said something about how the watch represented Grandpa's legacy and shouldn't belong to just one person. Easy for him to say. He'd gotten all of Grandpa's expensive tools, which were probably worth $15,000 by themselves. I realized then that my family wasn't just greedy, they were scared. They'd all assumed the will was fair because they thought everything was roughly equal in value. Now that it looked like I might have gotten the jackpot, they were panicking about being left out of what could be a life-changing amount of money. After they left, I sat in my living room staring at that watch and thinking about how fast my family had turned on each other. 3 weeks ago, we were all grieving together and sharing memories of Grandpa. Now we were talking about lawyers and court battles over a piece of jewelry. But here's the thing that really got to me. None of them had asked about the watch's history. They didn't want to know where it came from or why Grandpa had it. They just wanted to know what it was worth and how they could get their hands on it. That felt wrong somehow, like we were dishonoring his memory by treating his possessions like lottery tickets. That night, I made a decision that probably wasn't very smart, but felt right at the time. I was going to find out everything I could about that watch and how Grandpa had acquired it before I did anything else. If my family wanted to fight me over it, fine, but I was going to make sure I understood what we were really fighting about first. I also decided that if they wanted to play hardball with lawyers and court battles, I could play that game too. I had something they didn't know about, the truth about what that watch really was and what it was actually worth. And sometimes the best defense is keeping your enemies in the dark until you're ready to make your move. The next morning, I took a personal day and drove back to Grandpa's house with a specific mission. I was going to go through every box, every drawer, every scrap of paper until I found something that explained how a simple plumber from Chicago had ended up with Al Capone's personal pocket watch. What I discovered in his basement didn't just answer my questions. It opened up a whole new mystery that made the watch seem like small potatoes. Sometimes when you start digging into family secrets, you find out that the people you thought you knew were completely different from who they pretended to be. And sometimes those secrets are worth a lot more than money. They're worth understanding who you really are and where you came from. But they can also be dangerous, especially when other people find out you know them. Grandpa's basement was like a museum of organized hoarding. The man had labeled boxes for everything: Christmas decorations, old tax returns, spare plumbing parts, even a box marked "string too short to use," which was so perfectly grandpa that it made me smile despite everything going on. I'd been down there 100 times as a kid, but I'd never really paid attention to far corner where he kept his personal stuff. There was this old wooden filing cabinet that I'd always assumed was full of boring paperwork, and a trunk that looked like it belonged on a pirate ship. I started with a filing cabinet, figuring that's where any important documents would be. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: insurance papers, medical records, receipts for home repairs going back to the 1960s. But in the bottom drawer, I found a manila folder labeled Personal Private in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Inside that folder was a bunch of old photographs, letters, and what looked like business documents from the 1950s and 60s. The photos were mostly black and white, showing Grandpa as a young man with people I didn't recognize. But there was something about these pictures that felt different from his usual family snapshots. The people in these photos were dressed better than Grandpa's usual crowd: expensive suits, fancy cars and background, the kind of setup that screamed money and importance. Grandpa looked younger and more confident than I'd ever seen him, wearing clothes that probably cost more than he usually spent in a year. One photo really caught my attention. It showed Grandpa shaking hands with a well-dressed man outside what looked like a fancy restaurant or club. On the back, someone had written Tony R., 1956. "Thanks for everything." I didn't recognize the name, but something about the guy's face seemed familiar, like I'd seen it in a movie or a history book. The letters were even more interesting. Most of them were addressed to Grandpa using his full name, Michael Patrick O'Sullivan, which nobody in the family ever called him. They were written in that formal business style from back in the day, talking about services rendered and mutual appreciation and discretion being valued. One letter, dated 1956, really stood out. It was from someone named Anthony Rossetti, thanking Grandpa for helping him resolve a difficult situation with certain valuable items, and promising that this favor would not be forgotten. The letter mentioned a specific payment for Grandpa's help, but it was written in code, something about 50 units of a usual arrangement. That's when I opened the trunk, and holy crap, did that change everything. Inside was like a treasure chest of 1950s Chicago memorabilia, but not the touristy kind you buy at gift shops. This was the real deal, original documents, photographs, and items that told a story I never could have imagined. There were newspaper clippings about various Chicago businesses from the 1950s, several of which had been circled in red ink. Most of the businesses were restaurants, bars, and clubs, but there were also some construction companies and waste management services. At the time, I didn't understand the significance, but now I realize these were probably all connected to organized crime in some way. The most shocking thing in the trunk was a leather-bound notebook in Grandpa's handwriting. It looked like a combination diary and business ledger, with entries going back to 1952. The early entries were pretty mundane: jobs he'd done, money he'd earned, family stuff. But starting around 1954, the entries got a lot more interesting and a lot more cryptic. Grandpa had apparently been doing special plumbing work for various Chicago establishments. At first, I thought this just meant he was working for restaurants and bars, which would make sense. But as I read more carefully, I realized he wasn't just fixing pipes. He was installing hidden compartments, secret passages, and concealed storage areas. One entry from 1955 described a job where Grandpa had installed a false wall in the basement of a restaurant, complete with a hidden entrance behind a bookshelf. Another entry talked about creating a concealed safe room behind a legitimate business front. The pay for these jobs was way more than a regular plumber would make, and Grandpa always noted that discretion and silence were part of the deal. It was starting to become clear that my grandfather hadn't just been a simple plumber. He'd been the go-to guy for people who needed to hide things, money, documents, maybe even people. And in 1950 Chicago, that meant he was working for some very dangerous and very wealthy individuals. The final piece of the puzzle came in an envelope marked Insurance, Special Items. Inside was a letter from 1957, written by someone named Vincent Torino, expressing gratitude for Grandpa's help in preserving important family heirlooms during a difficult period. The letter mentioned that one particular item, described as a gold timepiece with personal significance, was being entrusted to Grandpa for safekeeping. Bingo! There was my answer. Grandpa hadn't stolen Al Capone's watch or bought it from some shady dealer. He'd been asked to hide it, probably along with other valuable items, when the heat was getting too intense for whoever owned it to keep such recognizable treasures around. And somehow, over the years, temporary safekeeping had turned into permanent ownership. I sat in that basement for hours, reading through every document and trying to piece together the full story. My grandfather had apparently built a second career as a specialist in concealment and discretion for Chicago's criminal element. He wasn't a criminal himself. He was more like a service provider who helped people hide their assets when things got dangerous. The watch was probably just one of many valuable items that Grandpa had hidden over the years. Some of them had likely been reclaimed by their owners, but others, like the watch, had been forgotten or abandoned when people got arrested, killed, or decided to disappear. After enough time had passed, Grandpa probably figured these abandoned items were his to keep. By the time I climbed back upstairs, my head was spinning with implications. My sweet, quiet grandfather had been living a double life for decades, working with some of the most dangerous people in Chicago while maintaining his cover as a simple family man and plumber. The watch wasn't just a family heirloom. It was evidence of a hidden world that none of us had ever suspected existed. But here's the thing that really got to me. Grandpa had trusted me with this secret. Out of everyone in the family, he'd chosen to leave the watch to me, probably knowing that I'd be curious enough to dig deeper and smart enough to handle the truth. He'd given me a key to understanding who he really was, and now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The family war over the watch was about to get a whole lot more complicated, because now I knew something that could change everything. The question was whether I was brave enough to use it, and whether my family was ready to learn that their beloved patriarch had been keeping secrets that could rewrite our entire family history. Sometimes the truth is more valuable than money, but it's also a lot more dangerous. Armed with the truth about Grandpa's secret life, I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done, but it felt right. I was going to let my family take me to court, not because I want to fight them, but because I knew something they didn't. And sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemies think they're winning until you're ready to show your hand. Linda wasted no time filing the legal paperwork to contest the will. Within 2 weeks, I was sitting in a lawyer's office across from 3 attorneys, my brother, my aunt, and enough legal documents to paper my entire apartment. Their argument was simple. Grandpa couldn't have known the true value of the watch when he wrote his will, so the bequest was unfair to the rest of the family. My attorney, this sharp young woman named Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in estate law, listened to their whole presentation with a poker face that would have made Grandpa proud. When they finished, she simply asked if they had any evidence that my grandfather was mentally incompetent when he wrote the will. Of course, they didn't, because Grandpa had been sharp as a tack until the day he died. The first few court sessions were pretty routine. Lots of paperwork. Testimony from family members about Grandpa's mental state. Expert witnesses talking about the watch's potential value. Linda and Jake were confident they had a strong case, especially when their attorney brought an appraiser who estimated the watch's value at somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. But here's where things got interesting. During the discovery phase, my attorney requested access to all of Grandpa's personal papers and belongings. Linda and Jake thought this was great. They figured any documentation would support their case that the watch was more valuable than Grandpa realized. They had no idea what I'd already found in that basement. When we presented the letters, photographs, and notebook entries as evidence, you should have seen the looks on their faces. The court reporter probably had carpal tunnel from typing up all the gasps and objections flying around that courtroom. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a valuable watch. It was about understanding who our grandfather really was. The judge, this no-nonsense woman in her 60s who looked like she'd seen every family drama imaginable, called for a recess while she reviewed the new evidence. During the break, Linda cornered me in the hallway, demanding to know why I hadn't told the family about Grandpa's secret activities. I told her the truth, because I knew they'd freak out and probably try to bury the whole story instead of understanding what it meant. Jake was quieter, but I could tell he was shaken. He kept asking questions about the people in the photographs and whether any of Grandpa's clients might still be around. The idea that our sweet old grandfather had been living a double life for decades was harder for some family members to accept than others. When court resumed, my attorney dropped the real bombshell. She presented historical documentation, proving that the watch had indeed belonged to Al Capone, complete with FBI records and auction house estimates, putting its value at over $300,000. But more importantly, she showed how Grandpa had come to possess it legally through his work as a secure storage specialist. The key piece of evidence was a letter from 1959, found in Grandpa's files, formally transferring ownership of several abandoned items to him after their original owners had failed to reclaim them within the agreed-upon time frame. It was essentially a legal receipt proving that Grandpa hadn't stolen anything. He'd earned these items through his legitimate, if unconventional, business activities. Linda's attorney tried to argue that this new information proved their point about the will being unfair, since the watch was worth even more than they'd originally claimed. But the judge wasn't buying it. She pointed out that the will specifically mentioned the watch as a personal gift of appreciation, suggesting that Grandpa understood exactly what he was leaving me and why. More importantly, the evidence showed that Grandpa had been planning this bequest for years. There were notes in his handwriting, dating back to 2019, discussing his intention to leave the watch to me as recognition for being the one who would understand its true significance. Turns out he'd been testing all the grandchildren over the years, and I was the only one who'd ever shown genuine interest in family history and stories about old Chicago. The final blow came when my attorney presented testimony from a historian specializing in Chicago organized crime. The expert explained that people like my grandfather had played crucial but overlooked roles in the city's history, providing essential services that allowed the criminal justice system to eventually recover stolen goods and historical artifacts. In a weird way, Grandpa had been a bridge between the criminal world and legitimate society. When the judge delivered her verdict, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. Not only did she uphold the original will, but she specifically noted that my grandfather's decision to leave me the watch showed careful consideration of family dynamics and individual character. Basically, she was saying that Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing when he chose me as the watch's inheritor. Linda stood up and walked out of the courtroom, without saying a word to anyone. Jake lingered for a few minutes, looking like he wanted to say something, but eventually just shook his head and left. I felt bad about how things had ended with them, but I also felt vindicated. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone, and that's exactly what Grandpa had taught me to do. 3 months later, I sold the watch through a private auction specializing in historical artifacts. The final price was $362,000, enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, and still have a nice nest egg for the future. But honestly, the money was never the most important part of this whole experience. What mattered most was understanding who my grandfather really was and why he trusted me with his biggest secret. He wasn't just leaving me a valuable watch. He was passing down a piece of family history that connected us to one of the most fascinating periods in American crime history. He was showing me that sometimes the most ordinary people are hiding the most extraordinary stories. The rest of my family eventually came around, though it took time. Jake and I are on speaking terms again, though things are still a little awkward at family gatherings. Linda still won't talk to me, but honestly, that might be for the best. Some bridges are worth burning, if it means standing up for what's right. And you know what the craziest part is? After all the legal battles and family drama, I found out that Grandpa had left similar surprises for other family members. They just hadn't bothered to look for them. Jake's tool collection included some extremely rare vintage pieces worth serious money. Linda's china set turned out to be genuine antique, Haviland worth more than a new car. But they were so focused on what I had gotten that they never bothered to research what they had received. Sometimes the biggest treasures are hiding in plain sight, and sometimes the people who complain the loudest about unfairness are the ones who haven't done their homework. Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that will. He was teaching us all a lesson about curiosity, family loyalty, and the importance of understanding your own history. Looking back now, I realized that the watch was never really about the money. It was about connection to my grandfather, to my family's hidden history, and to a fascinating period in American culture that most people only know from movies and TV shows. Grandpa gave me something more valuable than $300,000. He gave me a story worth telling and a mystery worth solving. And that, honestly, is worth more than any amount of money could ever be. Thanks for sticking with me through this crazy family saga. I hope you enjoyed hearing about my grandfather's secret life and the watch that changed everything for our family. What do you think about the whole situation? Was I right to fight for what Grandpa left me, or should I have just split everything equally with the rest of the family? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. And if you have any wild family inheritance stories of your own, drop them in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.